Thank you for watching this video from the Center for European Studies at Carleton University. This project has received funding from the European Union and Carleton University. The views expressed in this video do not reflect those of the European Union or the Center for European Studies. Hi, this is Marakibi from the Center for European Studies at Carleton University, and I'm joined today by Dr. Emmaneul Sigalas. Dr. Sigalas is a visiting scholar at the Center for European Studies, and he specializes in Greek politics and also European space policy. So thank you for joining me today, Dr. Sigalas. Your research on the Greek crisis, has shown the ways that this long economic crisis has really put the government and the democratic system of Greece under stress. Now, of course, the crisis in its origins was external to Greece. It was a global financial crisis. It started in the United States and eventually came to Greece. But at the same time, there were structural factors within Greece, structural problems within governance and within the economy that had also been around for a long time. So I'm wondering, how did these two factors interact? I mean, how did the external crisis that arrived in Greece, through the Eurozone and from the United States, how did it impact the internal structural problems that already existed within the Greek system?
Interaction is a keyword, the keyword you mentioned. Actually, the Greek crisis, yes, originates overseas in Northern America, and then it reaches Europe, and eventually, of course, it reaches Greece. It was only a matter of time. So in Greece, it came a bit later, a couple of years later, after it started in the USA. It's also true that Greece had many problems well before the global economic crisis erupted. And it's sad to say that the global crisis essentially exacerbated all the pre-existing, or some of the pre-existing problems. It's a shame in the sense that Greece's economy was relatively weak in the European Union well before the outbreak of the crisis. So we were always plagued by problems such as high inflation, relatively high unemployment. But up to 2004, the country has made some significant progress. So unemployment was at an all-time low of 5%. Inflation was also very low, and the GDP had reached the EU average. So we were on a good track. Unfortunately, from an economic perspective, the foundations of this economic growth were shaky. Okay, they were shaky. It was based very much on consumption, on imports, and on borrowing. Okay, and as soon as borrowing was no longer possible from the international markets, then Greece was faced with the specter of bankruptcy. Having said that, it's difficult to find the root of the problem because economics and politics interplay. So there were also political problems that were also exacerbated with the economic crisis. For example, trust towards Greece's own democratic credentials and structures and institutions was not very, very high. The economic crisis led to a decline of trust towards Greece's democratic institutions. Corruption was a problem before. It certainly didn't disappear with the crisis. I don't know what exactly happened. We don't have the figures. But several of the problems grew further.
The financial assistance that the Greek government has received from external actors comes with its own constraints and conditions, comes with the agreement to certain economic reforms. These external reforms, in terms of the political situation and the democratic situation in the country, are these reforms beneficial or harmful from that perspective, or does it depend on how they're implemented or such factors?
It's a combination of all the reasons you mentioned, of all the factors you mentioned. I think first of all, yes, some of the reforms were in the right direction. The problem with the reforms, however, in general, were that they were not very carefully thought. Everyone seemed to have emphasized the economic dimension, neglecting, whether they're actually, whether it's actually feasible to implement them in practice, politically feasible. So I think there were, if you like, too many or only economists involved in this process, and too few political scientists, perhaps, who would have been in position to tell them that, these reforms, regardless of whether they're correct or wrong, are very difficult to implement. And if we do implement them, we will do them half-heartedly, and only parts of them. As a result, the end formula will be not the same as the original formula, and the end result will not be the expected result. I think this is what happened. So we don't live in an ideal world. We don't live in the world of the economics textbook, and it's something we need to remember. We live in a world where you have, in a democracy, basically, where you have periodic elections, where people vote in and out of government, which means that people are allowed to change their minds, and they can, in a way, ask from the government to also change their stance towards the negotiators, to change their policies that they implement. They have a right of doing that. And of course, this doesn't mean that the rest of Europe should follow suit, that they should do whatever Greece wants. This is not the case. But it will be, everybody will be well advised, policymakers, would be well advised to take this into consideration, realizing that, some reforms are more likely than others. Now, there have been also some economic proposals which I think were in the wrong direction, in the sense that they led to austerity, or that they were too optimistic, that Greece would be getting out of the economic recession very quickly. This didn't happen. I think politicians, both Greek politicians and European politicians and prime ministers and presidents, they neglected the fact that you can't live with austerity for a very long time. Okay, so after 5 years, if they haven't produced the expected result, then there's something going wrong.
There's recently been, in January, parliamentary elections in Greece, and the radical left coalition Syriza has been elected. I think in a lot of media this has been seen as a sort of major turning point or a major new development in the political situation in Greece. So with this new government, in terms of the problems you've mentioned, the distrust in government, perhaps issues of corruption as well, do you think that the new government is, in a sense, a solution or the beginning of a solution to these problems, or are they structural, and will the new government have much power to change the situation?
Well, first of all, it's a bit early to say, given that the new government is in place, in power for only 2 months. And one can only be optimistic that things will improve and that they will be different than the previous governments in the past. Having said that, I don't know if they will actually deal with the political and economic structural problems. It is a very difficult job to do for any government, let alone for a coalition government, which we have right now between Syriza and the independent Greeks. So Syriza in itself doesn't have the majority in the parliament. Furthermore, as is it's unfortunate to say that Greek governments tend to be also relatively unstable, in the sense that they don't exhaust their term in the parliament. So instead of having a term of 4 years, as the constitution prescribes, we tend to have a term of even less than 3 years. So the electoral cycle and the attention, perhaps, or the horizons of the government tend to be focused on the short term rather than the long term. And some of the necessary reforms are long-term and difficult reforms. It's also true that the new government has a new lease of support by the people. So compared to, I think, previous governments, they enjoy, according to the opinion polls at least, they enjoy a lot of public support. In the beginning, this is fairly normal. Okay, so because whenever you have a new government elected, people try to be optimistic. They will want to see. They hope that the new government will deliver what it promised. So they wait and see. Now it's, as I said, a bit early to say because you have the ongoing negotiations between the European Union, the IMF, and Greece. If the negotiations give something benefit, something good for the government, something good that it can actually deliver to the people, then I think it will enjoy even more public support. If they prove to be disastrous, then obviously public support towards the government will collapse, and I wouldn't be surprised if if it doesn't exhaust its full term. Most likely, what will happen will be a midway solution, not very clear, with mixed messages for both sides. So it will not be. I don't think it will be a huge success for either side. So people will probably feel a bit confused. So all this unclarity will probably linger for some time.